Hello, this is a video for BTEC Sport and Exercise Science Unit 6, Coaching for Performance and Fitness. And we are specifically looking, or continuing to look at A1, knowledge for performance and fitness. So this video focuses on the knowledge that coaches should have to enable them to be effective coaches. So I've just kind of loosely organised the specification here into skills in red, knowledge in blue, and green is planning for safety and changing conditions. So we're going to go through the blue content in this video. Again, the assessment criteria are describe, explain, analyse. It wants you to give sort of definition, key characteristics, explain through a variety of different sporting examples, and then to analyse. So what's the impact of having effective knowledge, or what's the impact on performance and the coaching environment and the development of the performers of not having effective knowledge. So always relate your examples, giving why things are effective and why things aren't effective. And that's just summarised here. So just to summarise some of the key things coaches need knowledge of or knowledge in. How to challenge and develop your athletes in order to improve their performance. How to adapt what you do to provide challenge and develop your athletes, what the sport characteristics and demands, so within any given sport, what's needed of the performers, what skills are in it, what technical skills, what tactics are associated with a particular sport, what offensive, defensive tactics are associated, what different techniques are there for executing a particular skill, and of course what components of fitness are required to be really good and perform well in that sport. So as broad overview, when you are coaching any given sport, if you had to do a session for badminton or for football, you kind of need to understand these different characteristics and demands. So what technical skills do the performers have or need to have to be effective performers? You as the coach obviously need to understand them, need to maybe convey them, explain them, demonstrate them. You need to know how to watch a particular technique or skill being performed and know what's good about it in order to get and how to improve it to give feedback. So knowledge of the actual skills and techniques within a sport are really important. A service in badminton is a skill, and we know there are different techniques. So there's the short serve, a high serve, a flick serve, different ways to execute that particular skill. You also need to know not just the skills, but the strategies that might be applied to and with your players. So in a match, you might suggest that in basketball, they play a particular offensive tactic to try to achieve something specific. And of course, you need to be able to coach your players to understand the tactics, to know when it's to apply them in a match or in a performance. That needs repetition and practice and skill of the coach in order to convey both, any sort of tactic within sport. You also need to get to understand that for any given sport, what fitness components are required. So does the sport require power? In which body parts? Is it legs? Is it legs and arms? Is it strength? Is it cardiovascular endurance? Is it, muscular endurance? Is it balance? Is it coordination? And you need to, within your training sessions, not just do the technical physical skills, nor the tactical understanding, the mental and practical application of tactics, but also you need to train your performers in terms of their physicality, their physical fitness. So just very briefly, and again, please pause the video and have a closer look. In order to be an effective coach and teach or coach a particular skill, you need to understand the difference in skills and how skills can be presented or how they're optimally delivered to performers. So skills are something that are learned. You're not born able to do a layup. You learn a layup. You might learn by watching somebody. You might learn by just having a go and figuring out what does and doesn't work. But importantly, skills are learnt, and we ultimately want to be so skilled that we can execute something, an action with minimum effort and maximum certainty. You do it so much that it just becomes really efficient. It's almost like you're not trying and it looks brilliant. You've watched, I'm sure, performers in your own sport being skillful, doing skills, and just looking so natural and effortless. That is what, skills, we're working towards those. So skills are learned, and ultimately we want them to become so ingrained that they're consistent. We generally need feedback to learn them, and that's obviously a critical role of the coach. We look at that later. We might need to give guidance. We might need to demonstrate, give visual guidance. We might need to give physical guidance. So you might move a performer through a particular action, and we want the performers to master the skills until it looks aesthetically brilliant and fluent. However, some skills are different. So, for example, archery, taking the shots, is a very fine motor skill. It's about accuracy, precise movements, small movements, whereas butterfly stroke, jumping are all gross motor movements or skills. They are big actions needing big muscle groups. So as a coach, you need to be able to recognize what you're asking of your performance and what conditions you might need to create to effectively teach them and coach them those skills. For example, continuity. So cycling, running are continuous on, you don't just practice the right leg part of running, do you? It's this ongoing cycle, continuous cycle of action. Then we've got the other extreme where we've got a discrete skill. So a somersault, you don't just do half a somersault. Once you commit to it, you have to do the whole skill. It's a discrete skill. And then you've got other skills, perhaps like layup, perhaps like triple jump, which have segments to it. The approach, the takeoff, the landing. The control and the pacing of the skills. So football is an open sport. Generally speaking, things are variable all the time. In a match, you never know what defenders are going to do, what your teammates are going to do. You have to be open and responsive to the environmental situation all the time. And therefore, typically, your pass is controlled by stuff outside of you. You don't just decide to pass because you want to pass. You decide to pass because there's a defender coming or a teammate is free. In contrast, other skills are controlled by you. You decide when you're going to start your run-up in triple jump. You decide when you're going to throw your javelin. You're not affected by other people. It's a closed skill controlled by you. So having that understanding, and this is actually part of skill acquisition, a broader part of sports science. Having this understanding can make you much more effective as a coach. I think it's great to appreciate that any skill can have a variety of techniques that will fulfill, completion of that skill. And I think long jump's an easy example. There are various ways in which, certainly historically, but today, you could jump over the bar using any of these techniques. You may have learned at school initially by scissors, where you stay quite upright and you kind of flip your legs over. Then you might have been, as you progressed, coached towards doing a Fosbury flop technique, where you kind of go over your back. These are all different techniques of the skill of high jump. So again, within any sport you might coach, you need to appreciate that performers have different techniques, and just because they don't do an exact technique that you might choose doesn't mean to say it's ineffective or wrong. And what techniques you try and coach, or what skills you try and coach, might be based on your decisions as a coach. How complex or simple are the skills you're trying to teach? If they're incredibly complicated, it might not be appropriate to teach that straight away. That might come near the end of your series of sessions. You might teach the simple, basic, discrete skills to start off with before you teach skills or techniques that are more elaborate and complicated. And that might be based on your players' ability and experience. A good coach doesn't just coach what they want to because it's what they want to coach. You have to cater to who you're coaching. That is effective coaching. Again, in the second assignment, 6.2, we look at practices and how you might build up the challenges within a practice or adapt practices. But again, just to introduce that, as a coach, you might make a decision, right, I'm just going to get my players to have a go. I might demonstrate it, and I want my players to have a go at doing a layup. You might find a certain percentage of your players will just get it and that's whole practice, practicing the whole thing. You might decide to progressively build up how they teach. You might start with the end wrist arm action. You might then add a step. You might then add a bounce and then a step. You might add the dribbling approach to do the layup. So that's called progressive part. You build up, build up, build up, and master the skill as you go along. Neither's right or wrong. And you as a coach are effective if you choose the right methods of practice to suit your performance. So as I said, progressive part means breaking down a whole skill into parts, mastering one, add another bit on, master them together, add another bit on. It's like you're adding it to the chain of parts. So progressive part building up. You can't do that with certain skills. You can only do this with skills that enable you to break it down. And it's really good for getting quality, but it can be quite slow. Shaping is perhaps more for skills that can't be broken down as much. You might just try to refine specific bits. You have a go at a whole and then you refine certain parts of it and focus on certain parts. Here's just another little slide that gives you a summary of different ways of presenting practices to players to help them learn and master. Another thing to consider being an effective coach is when you're running your practices, do you do what we call massed practice? So this is where you just do loads and loads of repetition, no intervals, no recovery, no break, might go on for a while, repetition. This is really good for skills which you have to groove. So for example, tennis players hitting forehand after forehand after forehand, or shooting in basketball or netball. What you want to do is make whatever the skill is or the technique is just so habitual it becomes natural. However, if it is so repetitious, you have to be cautious about fatigue and the quality of the performance, and also boredom. You have to again be mindful of the psychological demand. If it's a really complicated skill, you've got to give people's head a breather as well. Now, in contrast to that, you could arrange for your players in a practice to do a distributed practice. And that's kind of the opposite. Practice a bit, have a recovery interval, do something light or different, or walk back, or discuss, go again. Then have a rest interval, go again. The rest interval doesn't need to be sat down doing nothing. It can be something that is different or lighter or distraction. But it breaks up what you're asking of them. And this is really important for, physically demanding drills, or very complicated drills or dangerous drills. In that rest interval, you could do mental rehearsals to get them to think through and picture the skill. So this gives the players physical and mental recovery, which the others don't, which mass practice doesn't. The flip side of that is it can slow down the process, but might get better quality. Here's just a summary of variations of that. This one adds fixed and variable practice, which I'll show you now. So, fixed practice. If your event or sport or skill requires skills to be executed in the same position every time, for example, any kind of penalty or set play from specific places or free throws, fixed practice, you take your shots from the same place, repeat, repeat, repeat. You may or may not, this is often good for close skills, like taking a free throw or penalty, and good for beginners. You don't want other distractions. But if the skill is something that in a match is much more dynamic and would be affected by other situations, it isn't necessarily realistic. But you might start with a fixed situation to encourage success and keep things calm. Distributed practice is much more varied. So you would maybe practice passing with absolute beginners in a fixed situation, just in pairs to each other, no other variables. What you might build up to is distributed practice, where you have to be more dynamic and interact with other things, pass different angles, make sense of what's going on around you, what other players are doing. Again, striking at goal. You don't just strike at goal in football, or netball for that matter, shooting, from the same position when it's open play. You have to be able to do that from different situations and different angles. So you would build up varied conditions to create realistic practice. So what we've talked about there are loads of ways in which an effective coach can create and maintain challenge and hopefully development for the players. Varying what you do, making realistic, understanding what's needed, making them work at their own standard, their own level. And I guess, you need to fill in the list of these, give other positive impacts. One obvious one is if you are always challenging your players, you keep them engaged and motivated and involved in the practices and the drills and their learning. If you don't set appropriate challenges or vary what you do or understand and know your content well enough, they won't improve. It's as simple as that. Okay, so slightly moving away from technical knowledge, let's move on to tactical knowledge. So strategies, your coach, as a coach, you should probably have a game plan before you go into a performance. That's a broader, predetermined strategy, often planned ahead. Within the game, you might need to respond to situations and make decisions and instruct your players to apply certain tactics, or you've already coached them to know when to apply certain tactics. So that's sometimes a little bit more reactive and responsive within a game. So without doubt, coaches need to know the tactics associated with whatever sport they happen to be coaching. Why might you need to apply tactics? To create attacking opportunities, to be effective defensively, when there are critical moments and time is limited, your standard dying seconds of a basketball match, you call a timeout, you tell them to do a certain play, that's a critical moment. To hopefully essentially try and win or avoid losing a particular match. To play to your team's or athlete's strengths, so if you apply certain tactics that they're good at, that might be advantageous. To try to counteract your opposition's strengths, so and avoid your own weaknesses. We don't want to, you don't want to make yourself vulnerable, so you want to do tactics that help you avoid whatever your individual or team weaknesses are. Take advantage of your opponent's weakness, apply certain tactics to take advantage of their weaknesses, and obviously try to minimize your opponent's strengths. So there's loads of reasons why, as a coach, you might wish to or need to coach tactics with your players. Now, at certain standards and above, tactics will be analysed, not only your own. So it could be that you as a coach have access to statistics on what tactics you applied, you did, what was successful, what was messed up. But you certainly also might have, before a competition or a match, information about your opponent. What typically do they do? What are their strong tactics? What are their limitations? And knowledge of both your own and theirs, as we've already addressed, is absolutely essential. And it might be through data. Data analysis and sort of performance analysis is really big in sport now. So again, you need to be able to not only describe and explain what tactics are and why you might use them, but you need to analyse the impact of effective tactical application by coaches. Why are they effective if they know about and can coach tactics? Well, obviously, they might be critical at certain moments and help them win or help them perform well. Why might they be negative if the coach either doesn't know or doesn't know the right tactics to apply or applies the wrong tactics, or can't coach tactics? It gets confusing and performance is limited. Of course, make your own up, add your own examples and other positive and negative impacts. So here's just another little sort of process diagram to show what could be appropriate use of tactical models. Players knowing the strengths and limitations of their own tactics, their own, or teams for that matter, and knowing the strengths and weaknesses of the opponents, knowing how to overcome the opponents or capitalize on their weaknesses, exploiting particular players. If you've got somebody who's an amazing shooter or striker, how do you apply tactics to get them in shooting positions? And obviously avoid your weaker players. It's got to be coached and trained, and that's the skill of the coach, to build in tactical awareness and knowledge and confidence through specific conditioned practices. You would start off very gently, make them more and more realistic and competitive, but you might, not put pressure on them to start off with. They've also got to know what to do if a particular tactic doesn't work. Don't just, fall apart. How do you recover and get on with it? And then hopefully, whenever they compete, they'll be able to select and apply appropriate tactics at the right times. Okay, so hopefully you know about the components of fitness from your school knowledge. You know that there are a variety of sort of slightly more health related or slightly more skill related. Every sport requires some of these, and effective coaches will know which ones of these are appropriate to their performers and therefore will build into their coaching sessions ways in which you can improve and challenge and measure these components of fitness. It's pretty obvious that, the main components of fitness for a rugby player versus an endurance athlete versus a gymnast versus somebody doing karate are quite different. And a multi-sport coach needs to understand different sports. You need to pick some examples and acknowledge which components of fitness are important for different sports, and then how you would measure them. So again, you may have done some tests at school that are a baseline, and then through the training sessions later on you might remeasure to give a sense of if you've made progress. So again, it's not just knowing what components of fitness are relevant, it's knowing how to measure them for progress, and it's also knowing how to train them to get better. What activities do you do within your sessions to build specific components of fitness? And then logically, you need to discuss and analyse the positive and negative impact of a coach's knowledge and application of fitness components. So positively, if they do know them, they understand the correct ones, they can train the correct ones, your performers will be able to fatigue less and sustain the quality of their performance for longer. If it's not done, or you focus solely on technique and don't really give time in your sessions to fitness, you might find you get really skillful performers that are unfit and ultimately lose because they can't keep up with the pace of matches. Now, to be effective, coaches need to plan. And when you're planning sessions or a series of sessions, you need to know some basic things. You need to obviously know what you're trying to achieve for the team or the person through the season, through the series of sessions, through that individual session itself. You need to understand the athletes. Are they competitive or are they more recreational? That might shape what you do. What's their standard? Is it mixed? Are they all elite? Are there any specific athletes that need more attention? Is it a mixed group? Is it males, females? How do they learn best? The more you know your performers, the more you're an effective coach if you can tailor the way you coach to how they best respond. What drills have they done before and how can you build on things? And actually then what you might find is once you're starting your session, you could look at it and go, oh, that's not working, or God, they've got that really quickly. And you might need to adapt. You might need to adapt to make the drill or the activities more challenging or make them easier. So the ability, you can plan so much, but actually some of the skill of effective coaching is within a session, having the confidence and the knowledge to make some changes to make it really challenging and appropriate for everybody. And that way, everybody improves. And therefore, following on, the drills that you choose needs to suit your players. So you might keep quite simple, straightforward, discrete practices. You might involve more turning, more pace. You might have, don't rush, just get the quality of your control. Or you might add speed and changes of direction. So you can adapt the distances. You can make the cones nearer or further apart. If your players are not very fit, you make them closer. You could add a defender to add challenge. And these are all ways in which you as coaches can manipulate practices to create challenge and develop your athletes. Of course, there are lots of ways of practicing the same concept. So here, this is on the right, shows ways of training for maintaining possession, but you can do it in multiple different drills, and you would need to choose really appropriate drills for your players. So perhaps you can think of your own examples to convey ways and knowledge that coaches can have to be effective to present their performers with a range of sports activities and drills so that they are challenged and developed, both in terms of performance and fitness. So a variety, if you do the same drill every session, it has negative effect for sure. Variety of ways of motivating them and presenting them with different levels of difficulty and challenge. We want to make sure that they get some success so that progress is made. If the challenge is too difficult and they never succeed or never feel like they're getting it, that's demoralizing. Knowing your players as individuals, not as a broad team, as one big collective that get treated the same. They're all probably quite different in terms of their capacity and what motivates them. Individualize challenges as much as possible. You can often do that within a drill. Adjust things. Don't, because you've planned a particular drill, if it's not working or it's not suitable, have the knowledge and confidence to change it in that moment. And that often comes with experience. Be able to analyze performance, and that again might relate to choosing to change it. If you're watching what's going on and you're analyzing it and it's breaking down, or they're just so good, then you can go, right, I need to change it. You need to maybe start simple and easy, but ultimately you want to move towards replicating competitive conditions so that they train at the same pace, the same difficulty as they will in a match. And obviously incorporating into it rules, techniques, and a variety of practice conditions. So again, here are some ways and some things to consider as a coach to be effective. How can you manipulate these things? You can manipulate the space. You can have a big area, a small area. Sometimes a big area makes it easier. Sometimes a big area makes it more challenging, particularly in terms of things like fitness and accuracy. You can manipulate the equipment. You could do a drill which just has, let's say, in netball or basketball, one ball being used, or you can have multiple balls. You can have the normal equipment, or you can have modified equipment. Young children learning to catch might use a big sponge ball rather than a small tennis ball. It's easier. So adapting and modifying what you do, how much equipment you use, can be really effective. Do you give your players lots of time by any conditions or restrictions you put on, or do you put them under pressure and limit the time? Do you have equal sides, or do you manipulate it so there's a bias for a particular reason? And that might depend on age or ability or experience, or the space you've got, or what you're trying to work on. How intense do you make the training or the activities? How long do they go on for? You need to judge that. Does the quality start to go? And of course, the pace of the drills. Do you, when they're learning initially, just let them jog through, walk through, understand it, especially if it's tactical, and then over time, once they understand, then you pick up the pace and it becomes more game realistic. So all these things are things that coaches who are effective will manipulate for specific reasons. And when you plan your sessions, these are the things that you need to demonstrate your understanding and can manipulate. Obviously, effective coaches should take time before any session to plan in detail what they're going to do, what they need to have, what equipment they need, what space they're going to use, what numbers, there should be detailed planning. Again, with experience, you might need to not have detailed paperwork, but certainly progressively as you're learning to be a coach, this is something that's pretty normal. And how you format your plan needs to make sense to you. Images are really useful, diagrams are really useful, key coaching points are really useful. You will find that there's loads and loads of different formats, and there's some more here. So we want a progressive session, something that starts with a warm-up, starts with maybe simple practices, builds up complexity, builds up to something that's more conditioned and maybe more game realistic. It doesn't have to be competitive, but it can be. Now, if a coach purely goes week by week and plans one session, it could be that they're quite fragmented and they don't follow on from each other. What they should ideally do to be effective is have a vision of where the series of sessions are going to take the player or the team. So you plan for a series and then you refine and give detail to each individual session along the way. That way you're building up difficulty, you're working towards this big aim. You might say at the end of 6 weeks, I want them to be performing at this, doing this, knowing this tactic, have mastered these skills, and then through those 6 sessions, you build in activities that get them there. So it's important to understand not just how to plan a single session, but how sessions interact, fit in with each other within a broader, bigger program. Something that you might need to be mindful of is something that we call periodization. So a lot of sports have various phases or seasons. You've got your pre-season, your competitive season, your transition or your post-competitive season. And what you do in those phases or those macrocycles will be different. You might be starting with baseline fitness in general preparation and so just some broad skills. You might be introducing some tactics in the specific preparation. You might be ramping up the level of fitness and demand that you're putting on your performers. Pre-competitive, you again are really honing in and trying to perfect things so that during competitive season you are performing your best with just ticking over practice. And then transition might be something that's completely different, still remaining active but not as skills based or as fitness based. So we've got this big sort of periods broken down into segments, the macrocycles and the microcycles. A microcycle might be a week, might be a session. A macrocycle might be a couple of months. And then we've got that broader cycle itself. So periodization may be relevant to certain sports, and certainly effective coaches need to plan for this. If you're an athlete and you've got race events in your competitive season, that's when you've got to be peaking. So lastly, analyze the impact of effective planning and progression or not. Positive things could, if you're planned and you know what you're going to do, and you totally have thought through the practices you're doing, you're going to go into your sessions confident and probably deliver a better session. And those activities will be appropriate to help your players develop individually at their own level. If you don't plan, if you don't adapt what you do to the performers, it could be that there's a plateau in the performance, or they disengage because they get fed up with doing the same drills, or not being challenged, or being excessively challenged. Again, add your own impacts. So there we have the knowledge of lots of aspects of being a coach and the sports you might be coaching, how to deliver practices and sessions, and how to plan for progression.